Imagine standing on a wall so thick that 3 men could walk side by side on top of it, walls made from volcanic rock, so dark it seemed to swallow sunlight, walls that had never been broken. Not once, not ever. Watching an army appear on the horizon, an army so massive that the dust cloud alone blocks out the sun, an army that doesn't charge, doesn't scream battle cries, doesn't do anything you expect. They just sit down for days, then weeks, then months. That's exactly what happened in the summer of 359 AD. And what followed next changed everything the ancient world believed about war, about power, and about what it truly takes to break the unbreakable. The city that was supposed to last forever. The city that didn't. It wasn't strength that destroyed Amida. It wasn't superior weapons or overwhelming numbers. It was something far more dangerous. Patience. And by the time defenders realized what was happening, it was already too late. Let me take you back to understand why this city mattered so much. By the middle of the 4th century, Rome wasn't the confident giant it used to be. Oh, sure, the empire still looked impressive on maps. The legions still marched. The eagles still flew over conquered territories. But cracks were forming. The eastern frontier had become a constant headache. And across that frontier sat an enemy that Rome couldn't intimidate, couldn't bribe, and couldn't ignore. The Sassanid Empire of Persia. Now forget everything you think you know about ancient Persia. This wasn't some backward kingdom of desert nomads. The Sassanids were sophisticated, organized, and patient. They had professional armies, trained engineers, experienced commanders, and a king who had been fighting Romans longer than most of his soldiers had been alive. His name was Shapur II. For decades, Rome and Persia had been locked in this grinding stalemate. They fought over the same territory again and again. Mesopotamia, that flat, open land between the rivers where borders meant nothing and armies moved fast. Neither side could win decisively. Neither side would back down. So Rome did what Rome always did when faced with a problem. They built walls, lots of walls. They constructed a chain of fortified cities along the frontier. The strategy was simple. If Persia wanted to invade, they'd have to stop and siege each city one by one. Each siege would cost them time, men, and resources. Eventually, they'd give up and go home. Amida was the crown jewel of this defensive system. The city sat directly on a major invasion route. If you wanted to march west into Roman Syria, into the heartland of Anatolia, you had to deal with Amida first. There was no going around it. Roman engineers had spent generations perfecting those defenses. The walls were built from black basalt stone, volcanic rock that laughed at battering rams. The towers were positioned so close together that archers could cover every single approach. Deep foundations prevented tunneling. Multiple gates allowed defenders to counterattack. Internal cisterns stored enough water to last for months. The city was designed to be impossible to take. The Romans looked at Amida and saw safety. They saw permanence. They saw proof that their engineering could solve any problem. Shapur looked at those same walls and saw something different. He saw a challenge. Here's what most people don't understand about Shapur II. This wasn't some hot-headed warrior king looking for glory. Shapur had been crowned as an infant, literally crowned while still in his mother's womb, according to some accounts. He'd spent his entire life fighting, negotiating, and planning. He understood Romans better than they understood themselves. And he'd figured out their weakness. Roman confidence lived inside those fortified cities. As long as commanders believed their walls were unbreakable, they'd never negotiate seriously. They'd never retreat. They'd never give Persia the respect it demanded. The walls had to fall, not just be damaged, not just be threatened. They had to be completely, utterly, devastatingly destroyed. So Shapur did something that most commanders would never consider. He took his time. The preparations lasted months. He gathered an army specifically designed for siege warfare, not just regular troops, but specialists, engineers who knew how to build siege towers and ramps, sappers who could tunnel beneath walls and collapse them from below, archers who could keep defenders pinned down for days without rest. He organized supply trains with enough food and equipment to last indefinitely. This army wasn't designed to win quickly. It was designed to wait. By spring of 359 AD, everything was ready. The columns formed. The standards rose. And the largest siege army the Sassanid Empire had ever assembled began marching toward Roman territory. The defenders of Amida had no idea what was coming. The first warning came not with noise, but with silence. Scouts returned from eastern patrols with strange reports. Dust rising on the horizon. More dust than normal. Much more. Then merchants stopped arriving from the east. Communication with nearby outposts went quiet. Something big was moving toward them. When the Persian army finally appeared, the scale of it hit the defenders like a physical blow. From the walls of Amida, Roman soldiers watched column after column emerge from the heat shimmer. Infantry formations stretching back farther than the eye could see. Cavalry units moving in disciplined blocks. And behind them, something that made veteran stomachs drop. Siege equipment, towers, rams, artillery, wagons loaded with timber and rope and tools. This wasn't a raiding party. This wasn't a show of force. This was an extinction event. Inside the city, panic spread through the streets. But it was controlled panic. These were Romans. They knew what to do. Soldiers took positions on the walls. Civilians moved to interior districts. Gates slammed shut. Weapons were distributed. Water supplies were secured. Amida was doing what it was built to do. The Romans had faced sieges before. They knew the routine. Enemy appears. Enemy attacks. Enemy fails. Enemy runs out of supplies. Enemy goes home. Time favors a defender. Everyone knew that. But as the Persian army drew closer, something felt wrong. They weren't attacking. The army halted just beyond bow range. Not an arrow's flight closer. Like someone had measured the exact distance. Then they started building. Tents went up in orderly rows. Earthworks rose around the camp perimeter. Supply depots were established. Latrines were dug. The Persians weren't preparing for battle. They were settling in like new neighbors. Days passed. No attack. Persian soldiers went about their business as if the city wasn't even there. They cooked meals, maintained equipment, rotated watches with patient regularity. Occasionally, a few arrows flew toward the walls. Not real attacks, just probes, testing distances, measuring reactions, learning. And inside Amida, fear began to grow in ways that were hard to name. You can fight an attacking enemy. You can break a charge. You can counter an assault. But how do you fight patience? How do you defeat an army that seems content to wait forever? The waiting ended without warning. One morning before dawn, the Persian camp exploded into coordinated movement. Shapes advanced toward the walls in the gray light. Not running. Walking. Shields raised overhead, forming protective shells that moved like armored creatures. Behind them came the siege towers, the battering rams, the machines of destruction. The assault had begun. The first impact shook the walls just after sunrise. Rams struck the fortifications with rhythmic thunder. Each blow sent vibrations through the stone, through the towers, through the bones of the men standing watch. Romans responded immediately. Ballista bolts flew. Arrows rained down. Stones were hurled. Boiling pitch was poured. The defense was fierce, disciplined, effective. Persian soldiers fell in windrows. Siege engines caught fire. Attack after attack was pushed back. The walls held. But the Persians weren't trying to win. They were learning. Engineers watched from safe positions, noting which sections of walls shook most violently, which towers had fewer defenders, where reserves came from and how long they took to arrive. Every Roman success taught the attackers something useful. By mid-afternoon, the pattern shifted. Instead of attacking everywhere, Persian forces concentrated on specific sections, older towers, weaker foundations, places where cracks had already begun to form. One tower in particular started to suffer, an older structure that hadn't quite matched the quality of later construction. Each ram impact sent deeper trembles through its frame. Cracks spread like spiderwebs. Dust poured from widening gaps. Then, with a grinding roar that silenced everything else, part of the tower collapsed. Stone and timber fell inward and outward. Men screamed as they were carried down with the rubble. Dust exploded into the air. And when it settled, there was a gap in the defenses, a breach. The Persians moved before the dust cleared. Infantry charged with shields locked. Archers followed, firing over their heads into the chaos. The coordination was terrifying. Roman soldiers scrambled to plug the gap. They formed shield walls in the narrow opening. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted in choking dust and smoke. Men died standing upright, held in place by the press of bodies around them. By nightfall, the breach was still contested. Neither side had won clearly, but the meaning was unmistakable. Amida's walls were no longer whole, and the Persians had learned exactly how the Romans defended themselves. After that first breach, the siege transformed into something far worse. The Persians went underground. Engineers began digging tunnels toward the foundations of the walls. They worked in shifts, day and night, carving through earth and rock with quiet discipline. Fires were lit below ground to weaken supports. Timber was packed into tunnels, soaked in oil and set ablaze. The goal was simple: make the walls collapse from beneath. Inside Amida, Roman commanders realized what was happening. The ground itself seemed to groan. Small cracks appeared in streets near the walls. Towers trembled without warning. The enemy was no longer just outside the city. He was underneath it. Roman soldiers began digging counter-tunnels. What followed was warfare at its most nightmarish. Beneath the streets of Amida, men fought in darkness and smoke. Tunnels barely wide enough for one person became battlegrounds. Soldiers swung blades in spaces where they couldn't see their own hands. They navigated by sound, by smell, by desperate instinct. Sometimes tunnels collapsed during fighting, burying men from both sides together in the same grave. Above ground, the conventional siege continued without pause. Persian artillery never stopped. Arrows fell day and night. Stones struck towers already weakened by underground excavations. Inside Amida, the city began dying inch by inch. Fires broke out in multiple districts. With so many soldiers needed on walls, firefighting crews were stretched impossibly thin. Whole blocks burned while defenders watched helplessly. Water supplies came under pressure. Constant fighting created constant thirst. Wounded men needed water. Fires needed water. And the population had swelled with refugees from surrounding areas. Then came disease. In crowded conditions, with bodies that couldn't always be buried, with wounded men lying too long in makeshift hospitals, illness spread like a second invading army. Men who had survived Persian swords fell to fever and flux. Fear became its own enemy. Soldiers who had been disciplined began showing signs of breaking. Some talked to surrender. Others prayed for relief forces that never came. Some simply stopped responding, their minds retreating from horrors they could no longer process. And through all of this, the tunneling continued. Each underground explosion sent fresh panic through the city. Towers that had stood for generations tilted at dangerous angles. Sections of wall that seemed solid yesterday developed cracks today. The Persians, by contrast, seemed relaxed. They rotated forces regularly, keeping soldiers fresh. Supply trains arrived from the east with food, water, equipment. Time was on their side. Shapur himself appeared occasionally, visible from the walls in royal regalia, never hurrying, never frustrated. A man watching a process unfold exactly as planned. The psychological impact was devastating. Roman soldiers looked at that calm figure and understood something terrifying. This enemy was not worried. This enemy was not suffering. This enemy had all the time in the world. The end came not with drama, but with exhaustion. Another underground explosion. Another wall section collapsing. Another breach in defenses that no longer had enough men to guard. By the time the final assault began, Amida was a city in name only. Walls scarred and leaning. Towers cracked. The garrison reduced to exhausted, wounded, starving men who had stopped believing in rescue. Shapur recognized the moment. The fruit was ripe. The attack came at dawn. Siege towers from multiple directions. Ladders against every wall section. Infantry pouring toward every breach. This wasn't probing. This was the end. Roman soldiers rushed to positions one last time. They formed shield walls, braced spears, fought with the desperate fury of men, with nothing left. But numbers told the only story that mattered. Persian troops entered through multiple points simultaneously. Defenders blocking one breach were overwhelmed from behind when another fell. Command collapsed. Units lost contact. Organized defense fragmented into isolated pockets that were surrounded and destroyed one by one. Street fighting was savage. House to house, room to room, men died defending doorways history would never remember. By midday, organized resistance ended. What followed was worse. The sack of Amida lasted days. Persian soldiers, after months of frustration and casualties, showed no mercy. The line between soldier and civilian disappeared. Fires spread unchecked. Those who surrendered were taken as slaves. Those who resisted died where they stood. Those who hid were hunted through ruins. One Roman officer, Ammianus Marcellinus, survived by hiding among corpses. He would later write the most detailed account of the siege that has survived to our time. By the time Persian standards rose over ruined walls, the city designed to resist conquest had been utterly conquered. Shapur had his victory, but the cost was staggering. Persian casualties numbered in thousands. Entire units wiped out in tunnel fighting. Noble families lost sons beneath those dark walls. The king himself reportedly wept seeing the price his army paid. This wasn't celebration. This was a lesson written in blood. But it was also a message. And that message echoed across the ancient world. The fall of Amida sent shockwaves through Rome that lasted generations. Roman commanders went into emergency mode. Garrisons reinforced. Walls inspected. Supply chains improved. The assumption that fortified cities could hold indefinitely had shattered. But the impact went deeper than military tactics. Amida proved something profound about power. For centuries, Rome relied on a simple equation. Build walls. Fill with soldiers. Wait for enemies to exhaust themselves. The Persians proved that equation could be solved differently. Patience, preparation, professional engineering, psychological pressure. These weapons were as effective as legions. Perhaps more effective because they required defenders to defeat an enemy that wasn't trying to win quickly. For the Sassanid Empire, Amida confirmed what they'd long believed. They weren't just rivals of Rome. They were equals, perhaps superiors in certain warfare. The prestige of taking a supposedly impregnable Roman fortress was worth more than territory itself. But here's what makes this story matter beyond ancient history. Amida teaches us how things actually break. We imagine collapse as dramatic, sudden invasions, decisive battles, cities falling in a day. Reality is slower, messier, more complicated. Amida fell because of accumulated pressure over months. Each day brought new challenges. Each week saw more defenders lost. Each month ground away more hope, more strength, more will. By the time the final assault came, the city was already dead in every way that mattered. Empires work the same way. They don't collapse in moments. They weaken over generations. Lose a fortress here, a province there. Fight wars costing more than they're worth. Face enemies who learn their weaknesses and exploit them with patience. Rome wouldn't fall for another century. But that summer of 359 AD was one of many cracks in an edifice that once seemed eternal. And that's the real lesson. Nothing lasts forever. No wall is truly unbreakable. No power is truly permanent. The only question is whether we have wisdom to understand our vulnerabilities before someone else exploits them. Shapur understood this. The defenders of Amida learned too late. Now think about your own life. How many things have you trusted that turned out to have cracks you couldn't see? How many walls have you built that you assumed would hold forever? And on the flip side, how many obstacles in front of you seem unbreakable right now? Amida's walls looked eternal. They weren't. Whatever challenge you're facing, whatever wall stands between you and where you want to be, remember this story. Patience, preparation, persistence. Apply enough of all three, and eventually, anything cracks. The Persians proved it 1,700 years ago. The lesson still applies today. So there it is, the siege that rewrote rules of ancient warfare, the summer that proved patience could break pride, the fall that echoed across centuries. History rarely gives neat conclusions, but sometimes it gives stories that stay with us. Stories teaching us about power, patience, and the price of underestimating enemies. This was one of those stories. If this journey through ancient warfare hit different, Smash that subscribe button. More stories like this are waiting. Empires rising and falling. Battles changing everything. Moments echoing across millennia. Drop a comment. Tell me what part hit hardest. Was it Shapur's patience? The defender's desperation? The nightmare of tunnel warfare? Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Someone under siege in their own life. Someone who needs reminding that walls can fall, but so can obstacles. Until next time, remember this. The walls we trust most are sometimes the ones we should question hardest. And enemies we underestimate are often the ones studying us closest. Stay patient. Stay prepared. Never stop learning. Peace.